So we are going to be covering JavaScript object notation. We're going to give you a brief overview of what that is, and then we will be using Ajax to update portions of your page with the JSON, or JSON, however you want to pronounce it, script. So I think the hardest thing about learning JavaScript object notation is trying to figure out how you want to pronounce JSON. Okay, so I've heard people call it JSON, JSON, or JSON. I think JSON is probably the correct pronunciation, but does not matter to me how you pronounce it. We are going to talk about what it is and how you use it. So JSON is a way of storing and exchanging data. It's an alternative to XML, and it uses basically name value pairs. So it's kind of similar to what you see over in CSS or declaring JavaScript objects. It's going to look a little similar to that. So there's some familiarity there. There are some definite rules to creating a JSON file that you should be familiar with, because if the file is not formatted correctly, you are not going to be able to process the data. And so everything is in a name value pair. Strings have double quotes. It does allow Boolean. It does allow arrays. In fact, a lot of the JSON data is stored in an array. You can also have objects. Quite often you end up with an object, and inside the object you have an array. That's not unusual. So this first example is just very simple. We have a couple name value pairs. You will notice that we are dealing all with strings. So the name is a string, so it's in double quotes. The value is also a string, so it is in double quotes. And then there is a colon in between. After the name value pair, there's a comma, followed by another name value pair, and this is all in curly braces. If you wanted to create an array, and quite often the data is stored in an array, you still have your opening and closing curly brace, and then we are dealing with employees. That is the name of our array. And you'll notice, because it's text, it's in double quotes, followed by a colon. The data is stored in an array. Okay, so we've got our name, which is employees, and the value is in an array. So inside the array, we have a bunch of name value pairs. That is what is being stored. This syntax is pretty much the equivalent of this XML example. So you can kind of see why JSON is popular, because it's a little shorter. Okay? You don't have to do all those opening and closing tags. Ajax can process JSON files or JSON files a little faster than XML. Because this is JavaScript object notation. Okay, the procedure to process XML is you have to get the XML, you have to use the XML DOM to loop through it, and you got to extract the values. And we saw how to do that in previous examples. When you're working with JSON, you fetch the JSON string, and then you use JSON.parse to extract the values. So it's a little shorter process, which means it's going to be a little bit faster. And so I have another example here. This is a breakfast value here, name, and then you can see the value is the array of items available for breakfast. So I got a bunch of name value pairs here. And I think the hardest thing if you create a JSON file is remembering to put, the double quotes around every single name, remembering to put the colon in between, and then depending on what you want for values, you either put it in quotes or just enter a number. And you can see I even put the numbers in quotes because I wanted the dollar signs in front of my numbers. And I wasn't going to do any kind of calculating on them, so I went ahead and put all of them in quotes. Also take note, inside the array, after our first entry, we have a comma. We have the comma after the second, third, and fourth, but the very bottom of that array, we do not put a comma after that. That is an error I have seen numerous students make. So be sure that you only put commas after the different rows in your array that have a row after. So when we parse the data, it is stored in a JavaScript object array using those name value pairs. So if we, for example, wanted to access the very first entree, okay, we've got our response object that we got back from the server. We subscript into breakfast, okay, because remember, breakfast is our name, the value is an array. So we subscript in with a 0, that gives us the first. And then we just simply access entree. If we wanted to retrieve the description, we would subscript in with the 0, and instead of entree, we would access description. Okay, and if we wanted to access the next entree, we subscript in with a 1 and access entree. Okay, so this is a little easier than XML because XML, you're using the DOM and, child nodes and node values. And here, this is a little more self-explanatory about what exactly you're accessing. So here is the code to process a JSON file. So you can see we still are doing our XML HTTP request object. Okay, and here I'm calling it XHR. And then when everything is loaded up, I call a anonymous function. I'm checking the status. I've got JSON.parse. This is my response text. Okay, so it's retrieving text just like it does with text files in HTML, but we have to run it through JSON.parse because it's in those name value pairs. That gets placed into the response object. Okay, and then I've got a little new content string that I initialize to blanks, and I get into my for loop. And so here I'm going to stay in the loop as long as my subscript is less than the response object dot breakfast dot length. Okay, and remember, breakfast is the name of the array. So it's basically looking at the length of the array. How many items do we have? Okay, and then I've got a little heading of entree, and you can see that I'm actually using the subscript to subscript into breakfast, and I'm grabbing entree. Okay, and here I'm subscripting into breakfast and grabbing price, subscripting into breakfast and grabbing description. So this is a little easier to follow than the XML child node and node value. So it's going to process every single item in that breakfast array, and then it takes that new content and updates the HTML. Okay, so that is what happens when the server returns successful. And just like the other examples, we declare our object, then we have to use open, where we're sending it get, we're telling it the name of the file, true for asynchronous. And this is a little different. We have to send with null in our parameter list. So that was just the little snippet of code that's inside the script tags. This is the whole thing, not much to it. All right, so if you want to see what that looks like, this is what it looks like when it runs. And if you want to see the JSON file, here is the actual file itself. So I have obviously a more complicated example because that was just one JSON file. For this one, you can display breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And depending on what button you click, it's accessing a different menu. Okay, so that is a little bit more complicated. And we're going to take a look at the code. It's in an external file because there's a lot of it. So you'll notice that we are listening for the different buttons. We have a listener connected to them, listening for a click, and then we have an anonymous function. Okay, and a lot of these files or the processing is very similar. So for the lunch button, we basically do the same thing. We have the listener connected. When they click, we run through an anonymous function. For dinner, it's the same thing. We have a listener connected. We run through the anonymous function. Okay, so the difference in processing is that the first one, breakfast, requires that we send it breakfast.json. The second one, lunch, requires that we send it our lunch file. The third one requires that we send it the dinner file, but the rest of the processing is very similar. Okay, so if we look up here for breakfast, you'll see that we've got the XML HTTP request object. We use the open command. We use the send command. Okay, and then once the server processes and it returns response text, it returns 200 because it was successful. Okay, we run through this code. And you can see that this is generic, right? We go into the response object. And then in this section, it is also a little bit different, right? Because here, the name of our array is breakfast, and that's what we have to subscript into. Okay? And down here, the name of the array is lunch. So that is what we're using for length. That is what we're subscripting into. But we're still grabbing price, entree, and description. So entree, price, description are the same. What's different is basically the name of the array. So when we get down here for dinner, name of the array is dinner. So that is where the differences are. So the differences in our three little listeners and anonymous functions are that we are sending different JSON files. The files are structured the same. The name of the array is different. So for all three of those files, they are set up identical, the difference being the name of the array. So with so much repetitive code, you may be thinking, gee, isn't there a way that you might be able to create a function that can do a lot of that processing since it's so similar? Yes, there is. Okay, so basically with the repetitive code, There's two solutions. The first one, I think this is kind of the lazy solution, but you would change the labels in the files. So instead of having a breakfast array and a lunch array and a dinner array, you just change it to menu. So they all have the same name, then you only have one function. Lazy or smart, you decide, okay? The other way you could do this is you could store response object.breakfast, response object.lunch, response object.dinner in variables and pass those variables to a generic function. Okay, and then you could use that variable and subscript in to get the entree, the price, etc. So I rewrote this using method 2. And you'll see it works. And then if we come and look at the code, okay, so you can see that I still have my listener for breakfast, lunch, and I have my listener for dinner, and I'm still running through an anonymous function, but the anonymous function is shorter because I pulled out some of that code and I stuck it down here in a process item function. So let's take a look at what this does. So up here, if they click on the breakfast button, we are creating our XML HTTP request object. We are doing our open, indicating that this is our breakfast file. We're doing our send, so it sends it to the server. And we're waiting for the server to process. When the server processes successfully, we are taking our response text, we're still putting it into a response object, but then we are taking the response object.breakfast, which is the name of the array, and we are storing it in a variable called array. And we are sending that array to process item. So then we come down here with the array, and this is where we have our content string, and this is where the for loop is. And now we are just using that generic name array. So we're getting the length of the array, we're subscripting into the array, grabbing the entree, subscripting in, grabbing the price, subscripting in, grabbing the description. And you'll notice that the lunch and dinner basically are doing the same thing. Okay, so here, once the server processes the request, we store it in the response object and we grab that dinner array, store it in array, and process that. So this process item function doesn't really care if it's getting breakfast, lunch, or dinner, right? It's going to process them all the same. Okay, and that gets rid of quite a bit of that repetitive code. So this example is not particularly exciting. There's not a lot of exciting data here. We've just got my function, and you can see we have display and a URL. We end up with 3 of them. And this code basically is processing those. And you can see this is how it's kind of putting together the link. Okay, and here it's adding the closing, and then it's just updating some HTML. So basically, it's going to end up showing 3 different links. Okay, so not super exciting, but it is something else you could do. There are lots of different ways to implement JSON or JSON. And so if you wanted to take a look at this article, it does go through several different ways you can implement it, gives you some examples. Okay, and you will be practicing this in the lab assignment.